Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening for our CAARI lecture series. I'm Lindy Crew, CAARI's director, and it's my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Professor Bleda Düring of Leiden University, who is with us on Cyprus as the CAARI Scholar in Residence for this year. Our 7 fellowships for next year are now open for applications, so please take a look on our website and see if you're interested in applying or know who others who may be eligible. I would also like to extend a special welcome this evening to Deputy Ambassador Fieke Hausman, who is here with us tonight on behalf of the Embassy of the Netherlands of Cyprus. Professor Düring received his PhD from the Faculty of Archaeology at Leiden University in 2006. Following his PhD, he was awarded a postdoctoral fellowship at University College London, which enabled him to work towards his important monograph derived from his PhD research entitled The Prehistory of Asia Minor, from Complex Hunter-Gatherers to Early Urban Societies. Following this, he was awarded a second postdoc at Leiden University and appointed to faculty there in 2011. This year, he was appointed to the post of Professor of the Archaeology of Western Asia in the Faculty of Archaeology, so we congratulate him on this well-deserved achievement as well. Bleda's research interests encompass prehistoric and imperialistic societies over a wide geographical range from the Gulf, the Near East, the Black Sea, Central Anatolia, and Cyprus, exploring the conditions for social inequalities and differences. He is author of over 60 academic publications, including monographs and edited volumes, summarizing from conferences he's organized. He has been the recipient of several research grants, including a European Research Council starting grant. Bleda has supervised numerous PhDs and postdoctoral scholars, as well as having a strong commitment to undergraduate teaching and fieldwork training. His fieldwork has encompassed collaborative and sole-directed excavation and survey projects in Turkey and Oman, and since 2015, he has been working on Cyprus, directing excavations at the Chalcolithic site of Chlorachas Palouros near Paphos, a site that we will hear something of today. And for those who wish to know more, Bleda will also be presenting his research at Chlorachas Palouros next Monday evening in the lecture series of the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus, which will also be run in hybrid format. I would now like to invite Professor Düring to present his lecture this evening entitled Reconnecting Cyprus, Exchange Networks and Society in the Third Millennium BCE. Thank you.
All right. It's a great pleasure to present here at CAARI. Thank you, Lindy, for your kind introduction. I have selected a topic that both fascinates me, but it's also a little bit daunting. It concerns the manner in which Cypriot societies start to engage with the wider Eastern Mediterranean in the third millennium BC, and what role people on the island played in these events, as opposed to possible newcomers from outside Cyprus that might have settled on the island around this time. So the initial part of the early Bronze Age, the so-called Philia period, between around 2500 and 2200 BCE is the usual dating for this. And among prehistorians working on Cyprus, the nature and the processes through which this reconnection occurs and the understanding of the Philia phase has been the topic of a lot of research, and very different views have been advocated concerning the nature of this process. Among the archaeologists that have worked on this are Porphyrios Dikaios, James Stewart, David Frankel, Jenny Webb, Edgar Peltenberg, Diane Bolger, Bernard Knapp. So basically all the key prehistorians working on the island. And in the last few years, 2 great lectures were actually given on the Philia and its nature. One here by Harry Paraskeva, that I know very well from our project at the Archaeological Research Unit, and more recently one by Jenny Webb for the ARWA lecture series. And of course, all these archaeologists know the assemblages and the sites much better than I do. And the fact that they differ in their interpretations of these assemblages and sites should probably tell me that this is a topic best avoided. So what can I bring to this topic? I think actually being a relative outsider might, in this case, be a good thing. So I haven't been part in earlier debates, nor am I a student of any of these researchers I just mentioned. So I can look at things with sort of a healthy distance perspective. And I can question some of the basic ideas that structure the arguments in this discussion. So today I would like to consider how conceptualizations of islands and the archaeology of interaction and connectivity have often implicitly structured our perspectives on the interactions between Cyprus and the adjacent areas in the third millennium BC. And I will also continue to look at this issue from the outside and draw my previous expertise in the archaeology prehistory of Anatolia and discuss some of the aspects that strike me when I look at the Philia from the other side of the sea, basically. I think there are some dimensions that are a little bit overlooked. So I will take an Anatolian perspective, and I will end by some thoughts on how we can think of connectivity in the third millennium BC in social terms. So that's the agenda. Now, Cyprus is, of course, a celebrated case of an island that has been cut off from the mainland for a very long time. So 5 million years ago is the estimate that the Mediterranean basin was flooded. And the current consensus is that the first people arrived on the island around 12,000 BCE at the very end of the last ice age. And I think Dora's trying to change that picture, but that's the current consensus. And prior to this, the island fits very well into a biogeographical perspective in which these larger Mediterranean islands are sort of unique laboratories in which very weird animal species can develop. And in Cyprus, we, of course, have these lovely baby elephants and baby hippos that they are just amazing creatures. And you have similar types of animals on the other Mediterranean islands. In archaeology, the idea that islands are unique laboratories in which very special developments occur has also been extended to cultural phenomena. And Parker Pearson has actually dubbed this the Easter Island syndrome. So the idea is that on islands, people do weird things out of sync with developments on the mainland, and there are unique trajectories of development that could only have occurred in these island contexts. And of course, celebrated cases are the Easter Islands. That's why it's the Easter Island syndrome. The temples of Malta, Orkney is another one. So there are many examples that can be mentioned along these lines. Now, this idea of islands as closed environments in which atypical cultural trajectories occur is also, in a sense, present in maybe perhaps implicitly in the archaeology of prehistoric Cyprus. So long periods of prehistory are represented along these lines, especially the later Neolithic, so the Chalcolithic, the ceramic Neolithic, the Chalcolithic, are often portrayed as quaint and isolated cultural phenomena, completely disconnected from the mainland. So a very eloquent quote by Broodbank, who's somewhere in the room, I don't know exactly where, but a few dozen kilometers from a northern Levant, well on its way to the rise of urban literate palace-based states, the archaic tradition of roundhouses, the heterodox portfolio of pig, sheep, goat, and fallow deer, and a younger but equally idiosyncratic style of cruciform figurines in blue-green picrolite reaches its climax in the local Cypriot Copper Age. So weird people doing weird things, isolated. And similarly by Joe Clark, by the beginning of the 7th millennium BC, communities on Cyprus had diverged culturally from the mainland. This divergence was such that the evidence for interaction diminishes to such an extent that communities on Cyprus appear to have been largely cut off from the wider influences of the mainland. The inhabitants of Cyprus developed their own local traditions and ways of doing things. until the advent of the Bronze Age. So the idea is that the islandness of Cyprus is crucial in understanding what's happening here in these sort of in-between millennia. Now, of course, some issues can be raised. The first one is what is actually an island? You could argue that we are all islanders, and clearly that somewhere there's a level of scale involved. And whereas it is clear today that for modern people, Cyprus can be considered an island. You can drive from one side to the other in a few hours, and you can fly over it in the blink of an eye. The question is whether it was a small place for prehistoric people. For example, if you were to walk from Paphos to Nicosia, that's something that would take about 5 days to do. And so it's not that small a place in terms of travel times. There's been a recent estimate by Stuart Manning that in prehistoric periods in Cyprus, there were between about 100,000 and 200,000 people. So not a few people either. So the question is whether people on prehistoric Cyprus actually conceived of themselves as islanders rather than, for example, people living in the Paphos district, and whether their experience was very different from somebody identifying as somebody living in Cilicia, for example. So yeah, for us with the modern geographic perspective, this makes a lot of sense to look at it as an island, but maybe the experience of people in the past was a little bit different. And the other thing is that the amount of cultural interaction between Cyprus and the broader Mediterranean is often presented as one in which the sort of default mode is that of a literally isolated island that is only connected to the surrounding world during sort of brief episodes. And there's one episode that is commonly reconstructed at the start of the Neolithic, the end of the Ice Age. Between about 9,000 and 7,000 BC is the first colonization by farmers. And then again in the Philia period, between 2,500 and 2,200 BC. And in both periods, colonizations are reconstructed as driven by exterior developments and dynamics. Thus, the Neolithic colonization was facilitated by the development of seafaring technologies, which presumably first came together in the Younger Dryas, and has been linked to the flooding of alluvial plains in Cilicia. So we're dealing with climate refugees, potentially. Likewise, the Philia colonization has been interpreted as driven in part by an increased demand for copper, but also people have been talking about war refugees fleeing to the island. Perhaps there's also the introduction of sailing ships, but that's of course a little bit controversial. And the period in between these colonization episodes, so the Chalcolithic, the Ceramic Neolithic, the Chalcolithic, about 4.5 millennia of history, is then, of course, the period in which Cyprus was out of touch, and people were doing weird, quaint things, have their own cultural trajectories. Now, can we really regard the absence of a correspondence in archaeological assemblages between Cyprus and the mainland, and the absence of a sort of sharing of technologies as evidence for a lack of interaction? Of course, if we do see clear correspondences as in the early Neolithic, then I agree that that's a good indication for interaction taking place. But the reverse is not necessarily true. To take a familiar example from the modern world, the Amish societies in North America differ enormously in their material culture and the way of life from other Americans. But to argue that they are isolated and not interacting with the world around them is clearly not true. So their lack of cars and their rejection of electricity and phones is driven by cultural considerations rather than a lack of knowledge. And for prehistoric Cyprus, this very point has been made pointedly by Diane Bolger in a 2013 paper, Matter of Choice, where she makes exactly this point, that a lack of correspondence is not necessarily a lack of interaction. And in fact, if you start to look for possible indicator for interactions, there is actually quite a lot that you can point at. In the Chalcolithian, we have postulated links in gypstone industries, engraved pebbles. There are imported carnelian beads from the mainland. For the ceramic Neolithic, we likewise have links in the gypstone industries. And it has been argued that the earliest ceramics of Cyprus are inspired by dark-faced burnished ware of the mainland. And of course, in the Chalcolithic, we have a lot of things which are coming from abroad. We have the imported faience beads, which were often considered to have come from the Levant, but now we also have some evidence that they were being produced in Turkey, in the EB2 in central Anatolia. We have Cypriot pottery that was found at Tarsus. There are some features in Cypriot pottery that might link up with mainland assemblages. We have spurred annular beads imitating mainland prototypes. And there are Cypriot objects made of Anatolian metals. And there is also a tantalizing link in the form of picrolite figurines of Anatolian types. Now, some of these links may be more convincing than others. But I think if you add all of this up, the idea that Cyprus was isolated and not in touch with adjacent societies cannot really be sustained. It's merely the visibility of these interactions, the archaeological visibility, that changes over time. Now, this brings me to what I think is a key issue in rethinking connectivity in the third millennium BCE, which is how the Philia period has often been conceptualized. And this is a slide from Harry, where he presents the Chalcolithic and the Philia as packages. And the Philia is then characterized by the introduction of metallurgical know-how, rectangular houses, the reintroduction of cattle, the introduction of woolly sheep, and textile technologies, the introduction of donkeys, the plow, spindle whorls, weaving looms, Anatolian-style pottery, cooking pots and hobs, and even cradle boards and tubular drills. And all of these things and technologies are presented as arriving in one package at the start of the Philia, and as evidence for a complete shift from the previous Chalcolithic. And this is then regarded as proof that a sizable migration of people came to Cyprus around 2500 BC. Now, if I try to think about this, there are logistical and archaeological problems with such a scenario. First, one could ask how likely it is that a fleet of sufficient size could have been mustered to transport not just a substantial population of people, but also a biologically viable number of cattle, sheep, donkeys in a short-lived colonization episode. So for animals that are introduced, there's typically an assessment that you need about 200 to 500 animals to create a viable genetic population. And so are all of these animals brought over at once at the start of the Philia? I don't know, but if you look at this in sort of comparison to the discussions that we have for the earlier Neolithic, where arguably we have better quality data for this similar type of event, Jean-Daniel Vigne and his colleagues have argued that the introduction of new animals was a process that stretched over hundreds of years, and that various animal species were brought to the island at different periods, rather than in one wave of colonization. And in their reconstruction, people must have been bringing new young animals over frequently, and they were frequently going back and forth between Cyprus and adjacent lands in Anatolia and the Levant. So I think this might also have been the case for the Philia. Now, if we look at the archaeological data, there's also some evidence that we might need to unpack and stretch the Philia. On the Chalcolithic side of the problem, there are numerous examples in the study of prehistoric Cyprus where various scholars have debated whether or not specific artifacts or technologies that were held to have been typical for the Philia might already have been around in the previous late Chalcolithic. Examples include spiral metal ornaments, spurred annular beads, cast metal artifacts, and metallurgy. And in most cases, when there is good data, there's actually a case to be made that many of these things actually already occur in the Chalcolithic. And this is a case which has been consistently made by Eddie Peltenberg and Diane Bolger. Now, to these Philia precursors, we can also add these Anatolianizing piccolite figurines here in the center. They do not come from good context, obviously, but if we start to look at the EB parallels in Anatolia, the best parallels are from the EB1, from Beyce Sultan, so dating to the first half of the third millennium, which would imply a late Chalcolithic date for these figurines, and possibly tubular drills, for which we have tentatively now some evidence at Palures from this summer here in the center, just below the figurine. And on the EBA side of the problem, there are likewise various technologies and practices that are better tested in the EC or even the EC-MC transition rather than the Philia itself. And sometimes they date actually hundreds of years later. For example, the plow model of Funus, or the use of donkeys for transport as in the iconographic evidence, that is, or the use of treadle boards for babies. So yeah, there is some evidence in Philia. I'm not trying to say there's not, but it's not always very strong. So I'm not suggesting that the Philia is not a transformative period in which a series of new assemblages, technologies, and practices appeared on Cyprus. However, if we were to conceive of this transition as something that lasted several centuries, rather than a sudden arrival of a group of colonists, a lot of these problems surrounding the Philia would, I think, start to make a bit more sense. So this includes questions such as why some supposed Philia artifacts and technologies are already around in the previous Chalcolithic, and also how copper metallurgy started on Cyprus, how people would have known about copper deposits in the first place. So, yeah, I think for a lot of these issues, unpacking and stretching the Philia might actually be a partial solution. Now, the next thing I would like to do is sort of step outside of Cyprus and look at this issue from an Anatolian perspective. And I should emphasize that Anatolian perspective is not unproblematic in the sense that there are relatively few well-published sites, and there's a lot of controversy about chronologies and dating of different assemblages, and depending on who you read, you will get very different reconstructions. In her, this is okay. In a recent lecture for the ARWA series, Jenny Webb made a very interesting point concerning the spurred annular pendants, in which she says that there is something lost in translation. And the thing that she was talking about was that the piercing in the Philia examples is on the side opposite the spur rather than in the spur, as is the case in Anatolia and elsewhere in the Balkans, where these things are found. The materials used are often also quite different in Cyprus and Anatolia. But so that something was misunderstood, perhaps. And I think this idea of lost in translation can be transferred more broadly to, if you look at the assemblages from Anatolia on the one hand and the Philia on the other hand. So also, for example, if you look at these figurines, Sorry, I love this figurine, so I've made it quite prominent in the talk. It does have very sort of interesting parallels at places like Beyci Sultan, more recently at Bleda Düring, which is in northwestern Turkey. But the parallels are not exact at all. I mean, if you start to look more closely, the shape of the head and the arms and the whole thing is quite different. So the resemblance is highly generic. Likewise, if you focus on pottery, there may be a lot of things that that don't really match. It was already observed long ago by Machteld Mellink that none of the Philia pictures are literal copies of Anatolian prototypes, let alone imports. And she qualified the Philia assemblages as selectively Anatolianizing, not Anatolian. And of course, Mellink was specifically comparing the assemblages from EB2 Tarsus, which are generally considered the best match for the Philia, with those with the Philia assemblages. And there are many more assemblages in EB2 Anatolia, and there's a great diversity of shapes and types. Now, apart from the fact that the spouted pitches of the Philia are inspired by and variations of Anatolian prototypes, there are also many Anatolian types completely missing from the Philia assemblages. And I'm not just talking about wheel-made wares and things like the depas and the tankards and the Syrian bottles, which arguably start in Tarsus after 2400. So the Philia might have started before that, and they came with assemblages before these things became part of the Tarsus or the Cilician assemblages. But also we have EB2 forms from Cilicia, such as teapots and two-handled jars and flat-rimmed jars and oval jars, to mention a few shapes. I've selected some of these here at the bottom that we do not have in the Philia. At the same time, there are a few shapes in the Philia assemblages that I cannot find in Anatolia, so in reverse. So, for example, we have these bowls with horned handles in the spotlight. They do not have a clear counterpart, as far as I know, in Anatolia. I've been looking around, couldn't find them. They do have something that resembles them. That's this one, but it's clearly a different vessel. So maybe again, we're dealing with this loss in translation issue. They saw something, they made their own reworking of it. The other thing that is striking is that we have these deep spouted bowls, which are not Anatolian at all, but they do have antecedents in the Chalcolithic. And so this might be one of the few cases where we actually have continuity from the Chalcolithic into the Philia. And it might even be possible to argue that the fact that we do not have these teapots in the Philia might be because they already have these deep spouted bowls and they would have been very similar in their functionality. I'm making a jump here, but that these things might connect somehow. So in short, the Philia assemblages are not a transplanted assemblage brought to Cyprus from Anatolia. Like Mellink already argued, they are a selective reworking of specific types and forms known from Anatolia, a creative referencing and reworking of an assemblage that was essentially foreign. And this partial appropriation and reworking of Anatolian pottery types in the Philia is also something you can see in other aspects of the Philia. For example, if you look at the architecture, okay, we have a clear shift to rectangular architecture in Marquis, which is clearly very different from the Chalcolithic roundhouses that came before. But at the same time, these buildings do not reflect or resemble what we know from EB2 Anatolia, where typically settlements are arranged around a large central open courtyard. Buildings are rectangular and have a sort of megaron type plan, so a portico and a long room, whereas the Marquis buildings are kind of courtyard structures. They are a little bit different in their both the individual buildings, but the settlement as a whole as well. And you can also make the same kind of argument for the burials, which I think is quite essential, because if I'm thinking about ethnicity and people moving, I think burials and cooking practices and those sorts of things are quite essential in thinking about ethnicity. In Western Anatolia, we have a large number of cemeteries, and they're all consisting of very neatly arranged burials, so they're all aligned in the same direction. And the actual burials can take several forms. We have the Pitos burials, we have cyst burials, we have pit burials. They've been mapped out recently by Michele Massa there in the map on top. And we are basically dealing with single burials. There are some occasions where later on a second person was put in these large pitoi, for example. But generally speaking, we're dealing with single burials. If we look at the Philia, this is a very different situation. You have the dromos, you have the rock cut chambers, you have collective graves. And you see a very clear example here. Nothing like that is known from Western Anatolia. You can find these kinds of things in Upper Mesopotamia, Southeastern Anatolia. But there, the pottery types and everything are completely different from anything you see in the Philia. So there is a clear mismatch between the kinds of graves we see in Anatolia and the Philia funerary practices. And this can also be extended if you look at the types of things that they put into these graves. So in the Philia, there's a great emphasis on pitchers and drinking cups. And this is actually not very obvious at all in these Anatolian graves. There's also a lot of these spirit annular pendants in the Philia. They are very rare in Anatolian graves. So you have to look very hard to find them. And then you have various things in these Anatolian graves that you don't really see much in the Philia. Yeah, I think the kinds, the burial sets are quite different. Now, of course, all of these things can be argued against. So, for example, we do not have any EB2 burials from Cilicia. I'll go back one slide, because, well, we don't. So it's possible that that in Cilicia things resembled the Philia grave traditions more. You could also argue that the marquee buildings do in some way resemble the townhouses in Tarsus more than they do the typical Anatolian buildings elsewhere. So there is some scope to argue, but I think if you sort of take everything on balance, these burial traditions and these buildings and settlement forms do not look like a transplanted Anatolian set of practices. Okay. Now I want to take yet another step back and talk about cultural boundaries. So the fact that Cyprus is an island has loomed very largely in these debates and has sort of served as an explanation for the fact that there is or isn't interaction. But in fact, we have lasting cultural boundaries also outside islands. For example, here in Anatolia, if you look at the Neolithic of Anatolia, you see that although Central Anatolia and Upper Mesopotamia are in contact and they're exchanging crops and domesticated species and obsidian, the cultural traditions, so settlement forms and burial forms and chipstone industries and everything that you can look at is completely different. That's now also shored up by DNA data, which shows that the populations were actually quite distinct in the early Neolithic. And so there's a cultural boundary there, a persistent cultural boundary that lasted for quite some time. The same thing is true if you go from Central Anatolia to Western Anatolia, there is a persistent cultural boundary that lasted for about 1.5 millennium. I could also talk about the Ertebille, where there's a cultural boundary in Denmark, where they resisted farming for over a millennium. So there are, in fact, quite a large number of sort of persistent cultural boundaries. And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is that these boundaries, they require maintenance. They make the people that maintain these boundaries active participants. They are making choices about what they are accepting and what they aren't. And so that creates a discussion, and this is what Diane Bolger has been arguing before, that these people on Cyprus are not simply passive, but they are playing a role in these processes. And these boundaries can act a bit like membranes. So some kinds of materials and practices can pass through the boundaries, but there is a selectiveness and a directionality to what is allowed to pass. So, yeah, first of all, I want to sort of briefly look at this issue of directionality. So we do have in the Chalcolithic, in the Philia, we have all kinds of things that look Anatolianizing, or things that come from Anatolia, such as the metal. But if you look the other way around, so in Anatolia, for things that derive from Cyprus or are Cypriotizing, I don't know if that's a word, but it's frustrating. And I've been looking hard. So we have, of course, we have the pottery in Tarsus from the Middle Chalcolithic. In Tarsus, we have, but beyond that, I don't know of any piccolite, bead, green, anything anywhere in Anatolia. It's possible that they are there and they haven't been published well, but I think there are some colleagues out there, like Vasif Saholu, for example, who knows what these things look like, and still we don't know about them. The same is actually true for the Philia. We have remarkably little Philia things in Anatolia. There was Jenny Webb recently pointed out the Haji Musular thing, a recent find. There's a Philia picture there that Jenny found convincing, so I'm quite happy to believe that is one. But there's actually relatively little stuff from Cyprus going the other way. So the directionality is from Anatolia to Cyprus, it seems. Also, if we start to look at kinds of things coming in, so traditionally there was this idea that Cyprus is in touch with all kinds of other places. We had this idea that Cypriot copper was attested in Pella, in Jordan, in Ayapotia, in Crete. Recent work on this, on the lead isotope analysis, has now suggested that this is actually not the case. So we do not have a sort of wider Eastern Mediterranean connectivity. It seems to be in one direction. That's at least what I am seeing. And Cilicia seems to, at the moment, have been playing a key role. Whether or not people from Cyprus are going there, making that connection, or there are Anatolians coming to Cyprus and bringing some materials with them, we don't really know. But people were seeing things and making Cypriot variants of these things that they saw coming from Anatolia. And then, I said these boundaries are certain things are allowed to pass through these boundaries. And if we look at, for example, the Chalcolithic, it's things like faience beads, and it's things like metal artifacts. So it's new materials, new technologies that are allowed to pass through. And in the Chalcolithic, we don't really see a lot of other things. So maybe the fact that these are new technologies and materials is what allows them to pass through. Maybe it's also the fact that a domain like the personal adornment is more open for this kind of adoption than traditional things like how you eat or how you do your subsistence economy. I don't know that's something that, but it is certainly selective, and yeah, that's what I wanted to say about that. Sorry, I'm losing track a little bit. And the selective appropriation is also what seems to be happening in the Philia, in the sense that they are taking certain things from Anatolian assemblages, but by no means the whole package. So it's this type of relation has a precursor in the preceding Chalcolithic. So we see a massive shift in the Philia, obviously, but it's a shift in this boundary and how it acts and how it's being maintained. And for some reason or another, people become less selective in sort of what they are allowed, what kinds of things they allow to come through. So that's basically the kind of argument I wanted to make. I want to end by thanking a lot of people. So I want to thank CAARI and Lindy and for having me here as the scholar in residence. And of course, my work, I haven't really talked about Palurus much today, but all my engagement with Prehistoric Cyprus starts from the work in Palurus, and all the support I've been getting from the department and the team and sponsors. So I would like to thank them as well. And thank you for listening. And I hope that this is of interest. And I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Bleda. And I think we can stop sharing.